Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
One of the things that people come up against when they're doing the work of your method and initial Alexander technique and conscious guidance and control in general is that when you're doing new movements or performing new actions based on the orders, you sometimes feel irritation or negative emotions that come along with that. And this can be a stumbling block for some people. So, how do you deal with negative emotions that come up both during the work and just in normal life, and sort of general irritations and stuff? Do we engage with them directly, or is it an indirect method? How do you deal with negative emotions?
Yes, it's a question that is obviously coming up with most students, and the answer is not that simple. It's not a straightforward system where you think, okay, you just think of something else, it's going to pass. Uh, this is not Alexander's view on the subject, because Alexander really discussed that. In a previous video, I can't remember which exactly, we already discussed that presentation that Alexander made of that gentleman, quite intelligent person. That was Alexander impression. And they were listening to a conference that the gentleman was very interested in the subject. And something happened that after a few minutes, the gentleman was irritated by the manner of speech of the speaker, and could not repress his irritation, was totally away from his original plan, which was to listen to the orator and make sense of what he was talking about, because he was so irritated. And so this is from there that one student of mine put a commentary in the uh, YouTube channel. And I thought that because this is the 100th hour of our communication, I thought, well, I'm going to stop a second and deal with her question. So I think the best way is, first I'm going to show an image with all the words she's written on the public media, and we are going to start from there. So first, this is a question. And it's not working for the moment. That's it. So you should see the question. So what she says is, I still don't really understand. The idea is not to suppress our emotions or reactions, but what then? The emotions are there. The irritation caused by the speaker's way of presenting the interesting subject is still felt. Is the idea, then, that instead of going with the emotion, in this case the irritation, causing the listener to be unable to listen, then the person should focus on our direction instead and just leave the emotion to being emotion? Or what does it really mean to become able to guide ourselves constructively and consciously without suppressing reaction? How do we get better organized in our heads and in our emotional life? And she adds, I still find it easier to respond to direction of movements about going from an unduly lifting of the upper part of the torso over to a rotation of the rib cage with the lower sternum as center of rotation. It was completely new, a new thought to me, and it took time for me to be able to even think the thought. But I can't get it to work like that when it comes to emotional reaction. What have I missed? So it's a very interesting subject. And I want to start very slowly to answer as I see the problem. And beneath all this, beneath the idea that, yes, there is the use of the self that is going to, in fact, condition how you react. There is also another habit, is the habit of the use of speech. How you are seated, how you are breathing, how you are directing yourself to make stops, how you speak. This is, of course, going to condition your reactions. If you're poised, if you're easily capable of making the difference between what you feel and what directions of movements you desire to be seen, for example, if you were filmed, then of course your reactions are going to be very different from a person that is totally focused on something else, something outside of the self, like a speaker, way of manner of speech. And of course, it takes time to establish this capacity to direct oneself, to think in activity. This is what we are going to discuss here. And I want to come back to something that is not said, that is not most of the time represented, is our habit of use of speech is influencing our overall use and, of course, our reactions. So I consider a person, and I think that this person, the listener, for many years has had a subconscious habit. And that subconscious habit has been to direct her attention toward what she feels, physically and emotionally, at any particular moment. When listening to the speaker with a strange voice, we can imagine that her speech to herself is directed toward a mounting excitation that arises at listening to the particularities of the voice. And of course, these particularities are already catalogued in our mind as a voice which make for an annoying speaker. Many people think that to give their attention to something important, they have to be fine. They have to feel at ease. It's important that they are fully receptive to the speaker. And if you have such a conception of how to think in activity, then of course you're going to find great difficulty in resisting the pressure to speak to yourself that something is not quite right. So I imagine that when stimulated like this, the person will be more or less covertly telling herself and repeatedly how annoying the manner of speech of the orator is, instead of using her speech processes for the original intention. So we imagine that she was listening to the speaker to classify, to describe how his ideas are organized, more or less what is the geometry in which his concepts are presented, and that whether she likes these ideas and they are unfolding or not. Well, that's the original plan, but now we see that there is a disruption. Her own emotion are making her incapable of doing what she wanted to do. And obviously we have a question here, because at the moment the subject of these talks is the the chapter that Alexander wrote in his last book, Learning to Do. How could she learn to do what she reasoned out and planned, when in fact she's impeding the process herself? So the point is that our conduct is, despite what we think, not governed by emotion directly. It's governed by speech, what I call covert speech. Covert speech is what you say to yourself. Am I talking too fast? Is this going well? What face is Kevin making at the moment? It's something I'm talking about in my head. I call it the covert speech. And in the case of this speaker, well, it's an imaginary situation. Covert speech will be seen to be directed unceasingly toward our feelings, appreciation, disgust, or annoyance, and of course not toward the matter at hand. That is to, in Alexander's word, to give effect to a decision previously reasoned out. Alexander is very, very interested in this aspect of our use. How to give effect to a decision that has been previously reasoned out. And in our case, our attention is not toward that at all, because our self-speech is sliding in the groove of being associated foremost with what she feels. So for the moment, there is no solution. For the time being, she's incapable of freeing herself from herself and to organize the capacities that she normally possesses to gather objective clues on the subject of the communicator's speech. And obviously to form a non-emotional representation of the subject that she wanted to learn from. So emotions are in her way? Is that what we say? No, I'm saying that it's her speech that is pushing her emotion to the fore. It could be possible to imagine that she notes the irritation that she feels receiving the speech as any other aspect. And she could decide whether this aspect of the whole situation should take the lead or not. In this case, it's obvious that not. But beyond this, she appears incapable of giving effect to a decision previously reasoned out when she feels irritated or unseated. So that is the general idea, but there are also some details that are necessary to have in mind. In this case, and this is quite common, it is also possible that she has not trained herself to think in series and to be prepared to gather more or less complex arrays of ideas into a consistent whole. You know, taking different ideas that are coming to you and making sense of these ideas, organizing the ideas for yourself. Of course, it's the speaker that is speaking, but if you don't, in a certain way, make his speech yours, well, you're going to stay at a very superficial level. Do I like what he says? Do I not? Well, you must understand that speech like this. I speak, for example, for 1 hour. And you have to understand that the ideas are coming one after the other, but they are organized with special words. And so you have to, in fact, trace in your mind more or less what has been said before, what is said now, expecting something to come later and making something, well, understandable out of all this, what we call a consistent wall. Because if you haven't got the consistent wall, how could you rehearse and consider independently of the speaker, independently of or like or dislike what is really said? She may not have been trained to create this form of representation. It's not something that you are able to do or not. You have to listen to speeches and start to organize your capacities. There are many different capacities. There is, of course, the problem of memory, the problem of... we are discussing the problem of directing attention when there are irritations. Yes, but this cannot be separated from the memory problem. What will she remember of that speech when irritated? Well, she will certainly remember that she was irritated. So that's one part, but the second that I have in mind is also that it is very possible that she has made no preparatory plan to deal with the speech at a later date. Maybe she has no definite plan to employ procedures designed to incorporate the new theory into her intellectual life, whether to develop the ideas as they are given or to criticize these ideas and their elaboration by the speaker. If you want to criticize, you have to know what to criticize and to be able to represent in your mind what it is you're criticizing. So let's imagine that she has had a training where she had been convinced to stop all intellectual effort, to live in the moment. And this acquired habit of not developing a capacity of description for future use make her presently incapable to stick to a decision previously reasoned out, when she feels irritated, of course. In consequence, this lack of future direction, of understanding the present as something that is going to be of use in the future, does not make for a capacity to easily shift our attention, easily shift the direction of our attention. Of course, the direction of the attention can be on the particular manner of speech of the speaker for 1 second, but then she could move away. Why would she be fixated on this? Yeah, and so this capacity to easily shift the direction of attention away from the feelings, away from the emotions, is fundamental, because when her speech to herself will zero in at her emotive reaction to the speaker of this discourse, then her whole plan is at the brink. She cannot follow the discourse because of her own irritation. Recently, a teacher said about my work, his personal interpretation of F.M. Alexander's book is not to my liking. It's interesting to hear. So, as I said, up to now, we have published already 100 hours of technical discussion, very technical sometimes, discussion regarding F.M. Alexander concept and sentences. And so when I read this kind of a reaction, I suspect that this particular teacher cannot give a 2-minute description explaining what part of my interpretation he dislikes and why. He has certainly watched 2 or 3 interviews before submitting his reaction. But I think his opinion is totally misinformed regarding the amount of work and dedication that went into creating my interpretation about exactly what it is we are discussing here. there is obviously many things he dislikes, but the skin deep reaction is the same kind of irritation we were discussing. It will prevent him from developing his intellectual interest regarding the many issues that we find in Alexander's books. And he will also fail to develop a representation of my interpretation to counter my ideas precisely. It's just a general like or dislike. It's not really helpful. So it's nice to know that this gentleman has strong opinions and that he's ready to manifest his opinion in public. Fine. But it's not helping to develop the reasoned discussion. That's what I think. And so behind all this is this, I think, a fundamental aspect is to understand that how we represent the ideas of, for example, an opponent. It defines our capacity to direct our attention toward difficult subjects where our emotions are going to be titillated. Our emotions are, or irritation. When you read or listen to somebody that is not exactly from your branch, from your way of thinking about, for example, the Alexander technique, well, of course it's irritating. Most people, they just want to hear a speaker that will approve of their ideas, that will make their ideas shine. If somebody comes and say, wow, putting hands on, is it really the be-all and end-all of the Alexander technique? Of course. Immediately you have a skin deep reaction or an irritation that is going to surge. Well, the control of reaction is to deal with these kind of things that are making it very difficult to follow our intentions, to be, open-minded and to be critical. I'm not asking people not to criticize, but to criticize more, to criticize more precisely. And the subject of the question we have today is precisely how to direct our attention despite recurrent emotional driving ideas. We are discussing the freedom to think at the individual level. It's there is a full chapter in the last book of Alexander in the the Universal Constant in Living. So Alexander, you will see, says that the lack of freedom of thought and action makes us the slave of our own reaction in thought and action. The exact sentence is there. Not capable of commanding freedom in thought and action when trying to keep to well-considered decision to employ procedures which demand for the successful carrying out a use of the self which is not in habitual reaction in thought and action. It's when you read this for the first time, I can tell you have to stop and weather the irritation, because the sentence is not easy to understand. Why didn't he make it easier for us to understand? Well, if you think about it a second, you will find that maybe understanding the sentence is not the first thing that comes to mind. The first thing is how to react to the sentence without developing such a reaction that suddenly we are cut from our reasoning mind and go full into your emotional mind. Oh, I'm stupid, I don't understand anything he says. Oh, this is bullshit. This is just words after words, and it's stupid. I don't want to read that book anymore. That book is just... Many students and many teachers apparently have a strong irritation to that fourth book of Alexander, saying it's just a compilation of different bits and pieces without any... Well, it's quite funny because that's where Alexander really discusses this idea of thinking in activity and the capacity to carry a decision that for their successful carrying out suppose irritation. When you have a lesson, you will discover, with a teacher of the initial Alexander technique, like Kevin is the same, like others, you are going to discover that you're asked to solve problems of use, of speech, of instructions, of movements, and that very often it does not go as well as you thought it could. There are going to be many occasions you will find of irritation. You will find that most often you don't understand how to solve the problem the teacher is presenting to you. And then you will start to understand that during these lessons, well, creating the poise, of course, is an object that we keep in mind, but it's not the only one. There is another one that is freedom in thought and action when solving problems. We want to establish a situation where the pupil is like in real life, not in a cocoon protected from any irritation, any disturbance, and just fully into the moment of receiving a magnificent teaching. Not at all. We want the person to think, and I think a good way to present it would be to think under duress. Thinking in activity is not thinking when you're lying down, looking at the ceiling and expecting something fantastic to happen to you. No. During the lesson, you have to solve problems. And you have to solve problems when you're filmed. That is, we want to see, both the student and myself, that when you are directing your mind with your speech in order to, in fact, do your decision of movement, well, we want to see that these movements happen, really, objectively. So, when Alexander talks about this subject, he's using the difference between freedom of thought and action and freedom in thought and action. Well, at first, of course, most people will readily understand what is meant by freedom of thought and action, because it's something of our civilization. Theoretically, citizens in a democracy have a right to think what they want in their head and to say what they think in public. You cannot put somebody in jail because he said that, we have a right to say what we want. That's theoretically, okay? And regarding their actions, citizens of a democratic state have a right, but that is, it is supposed that they can decide to do what they want as long as it does not infringe the right of others. That is the meaning of freedom of thought and action. If you want to become a painter, you can. Your parents may not be pleased, or let's say you want to become more nowadays. What do you want to be? My son would say, I want to be a gamer. So you want to make your life gaming all day. Yeah, that's what I want. Well, in a democracy, I cannot really say much about it. I'm maybe not very pleased about that scheme, but in a democracy, a child like this has a right to make his own decisions about what he wants to do. Okay? So we understand this idea of freedom of thought and action. Yet, FM, Frederick Matthias Alexander, is very keen on making us note that freedom of thought and action is a theory. And we know that because he said that we may lack the basic development of a freedom in thought and action to translate the theory in actual practice. I'm going to show you where I found these ideas. It's in the Universal Constant in Living, and that's what I'm going to show you now on the screen. Yeah, so that you can follow. So it's not working. That's it. So at the end of that chapter I was talking about, that is what Alexander is saying. He adopted the democratic ideal as the way to freedom of thought and action. But man failed to understand that in order to realize this ideal, he would need to develop to the full his potentiality for thinking in activity in the general use and functioning of the self, for which is essential not only individual freedom of thought and action, but individual freedom in thought and action, and which gives in process control of individual reaction and therefore collective reaction in the way of life, essential to the putting in practice the theory of democracy. It's quite a mouthful, and it's not exactly finished here. You will find that there is a following, and he says just after that, or just in fact in the book, it's quite interesting because the two texts are next to each other. I think it's the only part of the book where that happens. So that text is just next to the one you've just read. I'm showing a new text now where it's going to be commanding freedom in action. So Alexander said, my teaching experience has shown me that a person who has accepted the idea of freedom of thought and action and has consistently advocated it in his daily life is not, on this account, any more capable of commanding freedom in thought and action when trying to keep to well-considered decision to employ procedures which demand, for their successful carrying out, a use of the self which is not his habitual reaction in thought and action. Of course, when you give a lesson of the initial Alexander technique, you're asking the person to collect a few instructions, a few orders, if you want, and these orders are orders of movements for different parts of the mechanism, so that no parts act alone and all the parts act together. And so when that happens, of course, this procedure is not based on the habitual way of directing the self by the pupil. It's going to be very strange, physically and intellectually as well. You have several intentions in mind. In mind mean that they are supposed to be in your memory. And then you have in 2 seconds to show to the camera that you can make the different parts of the organism do what you described in the intentions, in the verbal intentions of movements. Well, very often you must understand that this fails. There are parts of the intention that are carried out in activity, but there are other parts maybe you have forgotten. Maybe you were so taken by the feeling of one or two of these actions that you completely forgot of the rest. We are not taught, well, it's not because we believe in freedom of thought and action that we, in fact, advocate in our daily life. Well, most Alexander teachers, they advocate freedom of thought and action, but it does not mean that when it comes to following a procedure that is going to start very irritating ideas in our mind. Am I doing well? Is that correct? I'm not going to be able to do this. Or all these sorts of secondary speech that we are talking to ourselves covertly, well, they will defeat the idea of performing the new coordination of the movement, the new use of the self. So we are training to change our reaction. We are training to withstand these irritations during the lessons. Yes, but it's just the start. What I would say to the student that asks the question is that you're just starting. You're just constructing your capacity, developing this little capacity of thinking in activity. Thinking in activity means be able to think and continue to reason when you are subjected to irritating emotions or irritating speech. And the irritating speech can come from someone, from the teacher, for example. Most of the time it will come directly from yourself. So freedom in thought and action is what we are developing. The theory of freedom of thought and action is something else. You cannot, by thinking that you want freedom, you cannot get freedom. You want the means to reach this idea of freedom of thought and action. And Alexander is saying that the means to reach the theory is to develop thinking in activity, which takes time. Of course, it's not something that you can receive. The teacher cannot give you the full development of your thinking activity. It's of thinking in activity. Sorry. So we have tools to start to change our reaction and start to balance our attention. Start to make our attention much more fluid so that we can, for example, note the irritation, but continue with the hierarchy of ideas that we set up in advance, saying that we were going to listen to a difficult speech on a very interesting subject, and we want to represent how that speech is constructed to be able to think about it, like Alexander said, rehearse it, and criticize it maybe. So that's Alexander's point. I understand it's a bit rough for the moment, so I'm going to develop some more this idea of freedom of in thought and action. So I will take the example of momentary obsession. An obsession is characterized by unwanted recurring thought that are coming while we should be, in fact, performing something, performing a reasoning or listening to a reasoning and creating a representation. So obsession is a word that comes from classical Latin, obsessio, and it means in English a besieging. It's from the old French siege. Which means seat. So besieging is trying to take the seat. And at the moment it's very interesting because the seat we are trying to control is the seat of attention. Well, obsession, being a besieging of course, our attention is an expression of lack of freedom of thought. An obsessed person has no freedom of thought to start with. So we are going to take that as a starting point and say that we are all more or less sometimes obsessed. by, I don't know, we can be obsessed by pain, by fatigue, we can be obsessed by anger, we can be obsessed by resentment. There are all sorts of unwanted ideas and recurring thought. Recurring means that it's coming back at you. The point is there is no, bombing of the zone so that the seat is made safe, the seat is yours. Mass bombing doesn't work here. The disconnected ideas are occupying the seat of consciousness and attention, and we have to be clever in order to solve the problem. So talking of clever, of course I read Pierre Janet, he's a French psychologist, and for him, an obsession is not a disease coming from outside that you can catch. No, for him, an obsession is a particular conduct that is learned, that is cultivated, and that is promoted by a constant mind chatter. The form of impulsive speech that A is describing what one feels, how one is suffering, how in the past, and form of speech that is also, without us knowing it most of the time, incubating the near future. So yeah, when is it going to get better? When is it going to get easier? Or how could it get worse? I'm sure it couldn't get worse. So for Janet, there is a striking idea there. The most predominant idea is that this kind of idea, this kind of speech is unconnected to action, what he calls inconsistent. That does not mean that the person is not making actions. Okay, the person is obviously subconsciously commanding actions of the different parts of the anatomical structure. The person is making all sorts of movements, and these embody the irritation that the person is feeling. There is a social aspect in being irritated by a speaker. You're going to demonstrate to the audience, and even if you're alone in your room listening to somebody, you can, if you were filmed, it would be seen that you're performing some movement of the neck, of the head, of the shoulders. The number of movement that you're doing in like 15 seconds is augmenting, as if somebody could see you and say, "Oh yeah, he's really irritated." And so when the person is irritated in this way and commanding this movement, it's absolutely clear that the conduct is not reasoned, that these movements are not reasoned out from the point of view of the whole poise. Absolutely not. It's not their function. Their function is to embody irritation. So there is conduct. For Janet, for Alexander, we call that use of the self, and that use of the self, of course, is not reason. So we want to change our reaction. In the initial Alexander technique, we obviously consider that reactions that are based on emotions, on this kind of besieging speech, are not salutary, are not positive, are not constructive. So yes, Alexander is not saying just weather it, the emotions are just transitory, it's going to get better. No, it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse, because this habit of speech has not been shown, has not been realized for what it was, and so suddenly we have a very wrong relationship with the means of the action, which is speech. There is a very curious reversal of meaning that is commonly referred to as acting out. A person is acting out. That means that the person is carrying out socially inappropriate or impulsive behavior that expresses the current thoughts the person is having, or the current speech. The person acting out is starting to be wrong. You should not act out. Well, if you remember what Jeanne is saying, it's exactly the opposite. We want to make our speech consistent. What would happen if the person that is receiving the annoying speech, what would happen if that person was really, in fact, creating actions? Sitting not as an accessory to listening to the speech, but sitting with the idea of improving the functioning, keeping the well-considered decision to employ procedures that are improving the stability, improving the poise, improving the capacity to maintain the seat of attention conscious. That's exactly the opposite of wanting to kill speech. There is too much words. Stop, make your mind blank. Well, making your mind blank is an effort of will, of course, directed by a speech instruction. Make your mind blank. Well, an obsession is a symptom of a lack of connection between reason, speech, and action. If you are asking people to make their mind blank, to calm themselves, yeah, you are just continuing that same train of teaching, because that's a train in teaching nowadays. Well, it has been for very long. The connection between speech and action is getting less and less consistent. This is not the way. So that is one part. I will come back to it, but for the moment, something else come to mind is that when you are describing obsessive conduct, it is essential not to forget. Well, I describe obsessive conduct, for example, from my part. I'm not a specialist of describing conduct of obsessive nature in other people. But when I describe this, it is essential not to forget the intensity that is arising and that is characterizing the condition. The person is animated. The obsessive person is highly engaged. Well, at fighting the obsessive ideas, for example. And while being highly engaged in herself, she's also isolated from her surroundings. Well, of course, at the exception of the annoying stimulus that triggers the reaction. When we say that there is a lack of connection between speech and action, we talk about this isolation. But with this isolation come something that will resemble a form of satisfaction. And it's very important to understand that satisfaction is in the play, because otherwise you're not going to understand where we are going to find the levers to actionate something against this kind of reaction. So what I say is that far from just suffering from this condition of obsession, this attack on our freedom of attention, the subject is very often deriving some security from it. It's the security of thinking that your opinion are valid, that yes, that speaker has a very strange manner of speech. Anybody would react in the way you do, and his ideas are really crazy. There is a security derived from that. you don't want to go too much into what he's saying because you never know, it can be dangerous. He seems shrewd and you know, like full of venom. So maybe it's better to stay in the intensity and the absorption in your own reaction. When you understand this, it's necessary then to stress that any reason procedure that you're going to ask the person to follow is going to appear quite dull in comparison, you know. Having a lesson of the initial Alexander technique, there is nobody that is making you feel something great. I'm not touching people. Initial Alexander teachers are not touching their students. They are not making them feel something extraordinary. They are asking them to perform, complex, coordinated procedures. And of course, this can appear quite dull. If you seek strong, stimulation, it's not the kind you're going to find with us. But there is a downside also, because in the conduct of obsession, there is another symptom. The symptom is the apparent surge of power or in power of the emotion and the growing uselessness of action. You will find that the subject starts to consider the emotion as an expression of the real self. It's the real me that is obfuscated. That is the real me that is unseated by this way of speech. I am my emotion. Well, they are their emotion, but they are at the same time the person that is completely forgetting how they are using the different parts of the organism at the same time. So they are a separated part of themselves. You can consider emotion, but there is a danger that when you consider emotion as central, then you are suddenly separated from all the rest. And then even in the speech, you will hear it. You know, suddenly emotions are what must matter most. And also, it's quite interesting that the essential or very nature of emotion is that they are essentially volatile. You're very, very tired, and suddenly you see somebody you haven't seen for a long time, and you forget you were absolutely tired just a moment before. Yeah, or you're very angry, and again you are suddenly changing, because that's how emotions are. But when a person has been subjected to the condition, to the conduct of obsession, the person will start to manifest a belief in a sort of fixation. The emotions will stay forever. As long as the particular stimulus will be felt. In our discussions, this is the comment of the person. Today I have a difficulty. Nothing is working. Remember? It's like the second phrase. The emotions are there. I cannot read that sentence without adding to stay. The emotions are there to stay. The irritation caused by the speaker's way of presenting the interest subject is still felt. So that means that the sensory or emotional perception is foremost. And the person is going to suffer all her life because of it. Nothing has changed. Nothing will change. It's a fixation. That's always a part of the question I receive. Yes, I hear all your talk about directing different movements at the same time, and but the emotions, they are still there. The emotions are supreme. They are above. What I'm saying is that recurring thoughts do not happen by themselves. The subject is talking to herself in a disconnected manner. That is the speech. When we say disconnected, we want to mean that speech is disconnected from action. There is apparently no action from the part of the student here. The student is just prey. The seat is besieged and the person is prey. I think it's necessary to change that perspective. We are not prey of our own speech. We have a possibility to direct our own speech, and that needs training. And we need to develop this resistance against what Alexander called the habit of projecting unconsidered and disconnected orders. Unconsidered orders. Very often we don't realize that when we say the emotions are there, it's nearly an order. It's something we say is going to continue, and we are discussing our own attitude, our own conduct. It's as if we are saying, yes, I'm giving full rein to my emotions. I'm acting out my emotions. Is that what we want? Well, I don't think it is. But we have to realize that this is how speech is conducting us. So we have to be very, very careful with speech. You know, when you start to project unconsidered orders to yourself, well, the person is going to start to believe that the situation of the siege is caused by the outside influence, in this case, irritation, and that this irritation is emanating from a source, from someone, from the speaker. Well, in that case, if you want a solution, the only one seems to eliminate the speaker, refuse to hear him, or at a different level to command oneself to eliminate the emotion, for example, to think about something else, to focus on calm thoughts, to, use suggestion. Alexander was totally against suggestion, I am not irritated by that tone. I am not irritated by these ideas. Is not going to help. Well, FM Alexander indicates very clearly that he considers this avenue as of solution as totally superficial and ill-conceived. He insists that the habit must be changed in a fundamental way. So we have to change the way we speak to ourselves. We have to discover that speaking to ourselves is very potent, and of course, if we do not, if we tell ourselves to think calm thoughts, if we tell ourselves to lie down and release, relax, and all that, there is nothing fundamental in this way of changing. And so for Alexander, it will only be a matter of transfer. He uses these words. So to transfer is to pass from a habit that is well identified to a new one that will pass undetected, or even worse. You can create a new habit to solve the obsession problem and consider that your solution is a desirable solution. So for example, let's say lie down very often and make the call, when it is just the same habit that will fester in the subject mind. I must feel fine, at ease, and I can continue my duties. Meaning, if I do not feel fine, if I feel obsessed, irritated, not at ease, well, how could I continue with my duties? This is the exact opposite of F.M. Alexander's solution in writing in his last book, which is the progress and development in the control of our reaction. It's time to read Alexander again. I'm going to show, and it's not working again. Sorry about that. It's really irritating. That's it. He adopted, I'm reading what Alexander is saying, and I'm showing on screen the sentence. And it's really irritating because it's absolutely not the image I wanted to show, but it's the one that we've seen earlier. So that's the image where he says that we need to develop to the full the potentiality for thinking in activity in the general use and functioning of the self. When in fact the student that was making this question was just in the midst of the training, and it was absolutely clear that a potential for thinking in activity in the general use and functioning of the self has not reached its full potentiality, so that she could be able to deal with emotional ideas with agility. Agility is the word here, the very important word. We want to be capable of withstanding these irritations and making sure that we can organize our conduct in a very deliberate way. We can imagine that with a little bit of attention, we can start discovering that we are obsessed, that we are under siege with these irritating ideas. So we have a habit and we want to change that habit. We want to stop reacting only according to the attention we are giving to verbal speech that is disconnected. We want more and more to give our attention to connected speech. So that's where Alexander intervenes. He's presenting the problem. He says that's another image, the image I wanted to show in the first place. And that image is, of course, also from the Inner Soul Constantly Living, earlier in the book. And he says, the truth is that so far, man has failed to understand fully what is required for changing habit, if the change is to be a fundamental one, because he has not realized that the establishment of a particular habit in a person is associated in that person with a certain habitual manner of using the self, and that because the organism works as an integrated whole, change of a particular habit in the fundamental sense is impossible as long as this habitual manner of use persists. True, we have all heard of people who claim to have succeeded in curing habits by following precepts of some teaching method, just as others will claim that they have made change in themselves by willing themselves to do or not to do on the trial and error plane. This is the first part of his intervention, and this is the second one. It is a demonstrable fact that control of the use of ourselves and control of emotional and other reaction is as closely associated as is control of manner of use and control of all that prevents interference with the raising of the standard of functioning. Therefore, if people beset with defects and bad habits try to make change in themselves without first making that change in their use, which raises the standard of their general functioning, the constant influence for ill associated with their wrong habitual manner of use remains, and any change claimed to have been made may justly be deemed merely a matter of transfer. So that's where I took this idea of change of habit by transfer. So it's important to understand the underlinings here. Alexander is saying that the irritation you're going to feel is going to be greater if the use of yourself is poorly directed. If you are not realizing, for example, that you're getting agitated, that you're showing many different movements of the different parts of the face, of maybe shoulders, maybe parts of the torso are going to move. If you are not realizing that, then nothing is going to stop the siege. The siege is just going to get worse. So the solution is not only to be capable of noticing that you're becoming physically agitated. No, the idea is to change the conduct of the psychophysical manifestation. Is to start using language in a new way, start to organize different intentions at the same time, start to, in fact, organize and planify how we are going to perform, to do these intentions of movements without taking much care of what we feel at the moment or what are our emotions when doing it. We are starting to be capable of thinking in activity when we are besieged with very strong reaction of our own making. It's very important. Yet, of course, when the student is writing her questions, it's obvious that she'll still beset with defects and bad habits of conduct. That is wrong use of speech. And so for the moment she is like in the middle of the river. You know, the river is rising and she's in the middle of it. So all our experience, our past experience, is tending to tell her, well, these emotions are never ending. They are always there. This fixation I was criticizing earlier is logical. It's only when you start to sit with poise, breathe with poise, stop breathing with poise if you want, and you understand that all these psychophysical activities are associated with strange sensation, emotions. And these strange emotions and sensation, one would think that they are not advantageous to our capacity to direct our attention. Yes, but with that new experience, you suddenly discover that these strange sensations, these emotions, these recurring thoughts are just normal. They are just there. They are not impeding our capacity to direct our attention. They are part of the game. The idea is to this is one idea that I have, is to increase the difficulty in every single next lesson so that the pupil gets more and more in contact with these unwanted thoughts, more and more in contact with these irritations, with the siege is not, in fact, defining your freedom. Or it's defining your freedom in negative. That is, it's because you know you're a siege that you can exert your freedom of thought in activity. So we have a long discussion. I'm suddenly realizing that I've gone too long now, and so I think I will continue what I've prepared in the next session. Any thought, Kevin? Any comment you want to make?
Yes, there are some emotions that are useful for the work that you might want to use your speech to encourage. For example, curiosity. So you're trying to figure out how things are connected or the cause and effect relations between things Alexander talks about, or the child who's curious about how their own body mechanics work. There's also like a sense of playfulness is a useful emotion for this. So you're if you treat it like a game and you're playing, can help in the work. So it's not just, so those are things you might want to encourage that as they arise, they're useful to encourage with your inner speech, or just general enthusiasm to solve a problem, which is useful because I mean a lot of people come to the work because they have a problem that they're trying to solve. A few it's more about self-development, but most people it seems to be they're encouraged to solve a problem. So those are useful to get started with the work. So it's not like we're saying you're a zombie with no emotions. It's that you're controlling your reactions, and if they're useful, you would allow them, and you're not allowing any random emotion, especially negative ones like anger and fear, which come up during lessons, to take the seat of your attention.
Yes, but there is a big difference between this idea of suppressing the bad emotions, of fighting the bad emotions, of making them disappear, of being so balanced that no emotion is going to reach you. No, it's not the case. What I wanted to explain is that the siege is going on. There are recurring thoughts. They are sometimes irritating. And the idea is not to try to suppress them. It's just to be sufficiently organized to be capable of seeing them for what they are. Yeah, parts of our speech that is not connected. And as we are developing connected speech habits, we can, during the moment I'm listening to an irritating speech, I have plenty of time to reorganize myself, organize the different movements so that I enhance the capacity for breathing, the capacity for elastic support, and that makes me, capable of having some attention to irritating factors, some attentions to stimulating factors, stimulating emotions, and most of my attention on the procedures I need to use in order to make an honest description of the speech I'm listening to. So continuing with what I've decided to do, and observing. It's like a position of an active observer that is saying, oh yes, there is this, there is that, there is, and there is also my main goal for the moment, which is to create sufficient seat for creating a representation of what is discussed here. And so
it's been able to think of more than one thing at a time.
Yeah, we are not about against emotions. There are some people that say, yes, but emotions are a big part of life. Wow, yeah. I think they're right. Yeah, I was not discussing this. Yeah, we need some fuel. And it's clear that emotions is a fuel, but you can start to engineer your emotions, as you said. Curiosity, for example, a never-ending intellectual problem of conscious control. That was Alexander said. He said that this technique is fueling these never-ending problems. And so, yes, we are stimulated, that's for sure. We are very stimulated by the idea of freedom in thought and action. That's for sure. And of course, emotions are part of the picture, of the whole picture.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jeando. For people watching, you can book a lesson with Jeando and get really irritated for an hour. Underneath, there's a link to his Facebook and his email address. And we'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Thank you. Bye.